Welcome to the deep dive. We've got quite the story for you all today. It's the epic tale of how our planet went green.
It really is an incredible story. And it didn't happen overnight either. It was a process of constant innovation, a continuous adaptation of plants across billions of years.
Yeah. Nature's longest running show, you could say, with plants, the stars,
Yeah.
always evolving.
Exactly. We're dealing with a timescale that's just massive. It's impossible for us to cover every single detail, but we can at least hit those major evolutionary leaps, the ones that really shaped the plant life we see all around us today.
Right. And I guess you could think of us as detectives piecing together this prehistoric puzzle.
Uh-huh.
We've got the geological record, chemical signatures in rocks, and of course the fossils themselves, which give us little glimpses into these ancient plant forms. So where does this green story even begin? What are the very first chapters?
Well, we got to start with who the players are. When we talk about plants, what we usually mean is land plants. Scientifically, they're called embryophyta, and this covers a vast range, from the tiniest mosses to the tallest redwood trees.
Okay.
But there's this broader group, Plantae, or green plants.
Mm-hmm.
And this group also includes green algae. So the general scientific understanding is that land plants, they evolved from a specific group of freshwater green algae called charophytes, most likely from ancestors pretty similar to what we see today, the Mediophysii.
So it sounds like algae are the ancient aquatic relatives to all the plants we see on land today.
Exactly.
Fascinating. But how did those early aquatic organisms, how did they develop that ability to photosynthesize, to capture sunlight and actually, create energy?
That's thanks to chloroplasts. They're these tiny powerhouses inside plant cells, and they're what make photosynthesis happen. But the origin of chloroplasts, that's a story of endosymbiosis. Basically, picture this. You've got a primitive cell, right? And it engulfs this cyanobacterium, a single-celled organism that could already do photosynthesis. But instead of digesting it, the host cell kept it around. And over time, over a very long time, this relationship, this symbiosis, led to the evolution of all photosynthesizing eukaryotes. And that includes the ancestors of green algae and eventually land plants, too.
Wow, a cellular merger with monumental consequences. And these cyanobacteria, these were like the original solar-powered life forms, right? The first to tap into that energy source on a massive scale.
That's right. And we can see some indirect evidence of that oxygen-producing photosynthesis.
Okay.
The fossil record points to about 3,000 million years ago.
Okay.
We see specific chemical and isotopic signatures in rocks from that time period. And we also find fossilized colonies of the cyanobacteria themselves. These tiny organisms were using water as part of their photosynthesis, releasing oxygen as a byproduct. And this transformed the Earth's early atmosphere. It went from an atmosphere without free oxygen to one with it.
Breathing life into the atmosphere as we know it. Wow. So this early oxygen production, what sort of immediate effects did that have on the planet?
Oh, the effects were huge. First, the oxygen reacted with all that dissolved iron in the oceans. And so you get iron oxide, rust, precipitating out and forming these banded iron formations. DIFs, we call them BIFs. They're distinctive layers, and they're key evidence for this chapter of photosynthesis.
Oh, wow.
And then, as oxygen levels kept increasing in the atmosphere, you get the formation of the ozone layer,
Right.
which, as we know, protects Earth from harmful UV radiation. But importantly, this rising oxygen, it was actually toxic to many of those anaerobic organisms that were around then.
Really?
Yeah, it caused a major shift in the environment.
Yeah.
And that shift paved the way for aerobic life to take hold and flourish, including life on land eventually.
It sounds like it was a case of innovate or evaporate for early life. Survival of the oxygen fittest.
You could say that. We also find evidence of these cyanobacteria, their activity in stromatolites. They're these fascinating layered structures. You can still see some of them in parts of the world today. They're formed by microbial biofilms, much like the ones cyanobacteria made, that trapped and bound sediments together. So while pinning down exactly what those early cyanobacteria were like can be tough, those chemical signatures, the isotopes, the stromatolites, they all point to a major impact on the planet.
And we've got a timeline graphic here that shows this immense history, right? So what does that tell us about these photosynthetic pioneers?
It shows just how these major evolutionary events played out across huge timescales.
Yeah.
The axis is marked in millions of years ago, and it highlights some of the innovations we'll be talking about. Spores, vascular tissues, roots, seeds, complex structures like wood and leaves. It really puts it all into perspective. the sheer scale of this greening process.
Okay, so that's the dawn of green life and its planet-altering effects. Let's move into the Paleozoic era. What did plant life look like then, starting with the Cambrian period?
Okay, so the Cambrian period, that kicked off about 541 million years ago,
Mm.
and plant life then was pretty basic. We're talking mostly small, unicellular, or filamentous organisms with very simple branching.
Okay.
And actually, finding definitive plant fossils from this time is pretty hard because they were so small.
Hmm.
Soft bodies, too. It's a real challenge to tell them apart from other simple organisms that may not have been on the path to becoming land plants.
So I'm guessing the landscape wasn't exactly lush with vegetation back then, more like a microscopic film of green.
Exactly. There is one group, though, the Decyclodales. They're calcareous green algae, and we find fossils of them going back to the Middle Cambrian. But it's important to note, while they're ancient, these algae aren't considered direct ancestors of land plants. In fact, land plants didn't even have vascular tissues, that internal transport system for water and nutrients, until much later, the mid-Silurian period.
Okay, mid-Silurian. That sounds like a pretty key development. But before we get there, what was going on with plant life during the Ordovician?
Well, the Ordovician period started around 485 million years ago, and it marks a big shift in our understanding of early land plants.
Okay.
This is when we see those first widespread embryophyte spores in the fossil record. We're talking about 470 million years ago.
Yep.
These early spores, they've been found in places like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Argentina, all over. And they're preserved as single spores called monads, or groups of four called tetrads,
Oh.
often with these Y-shaped markings called trellis marks on their outer walls.
Spores, kind of like what ferns use today.
Functionally, yeah, similar. These early land plants, they probably look like liverworts, those small, low-lying plants. And they didn't have those conducting tissues we talked about. But the interesting thing about their spores is that tough outer layer made of super-resistant polymers. This coating provided crucial protection against UV radiation, drying out, even attacks from early microbes. Spores were their way to spread and survive on land.
So tiny little protected packages letting them venture out. And then comes the Silurian. What evolutionary leaps did plants take during that time?
Okay, so the Silurian period started around 443 million years ago. And this is when we see the first evidence of vascular plants. These were true land plants, the first with those specialized tissues to transport water and nutrients.
Wow.
The earliest we know of, mostly found in the northern hemisphere, belonged to the genus Cooksonia. They were relatively simple plants, just a few centimeters tall, with basic branching stems and small, round sporangia. Those are the spore-producing structures at their tips.
So the first signs of an internal plumbing system. That must have been a game changer for plant size and for them to spread out more, right?
Absolutely. By the late Silurian, we see more complex vascular plants evolving, like the zostrophils. They had sporangia along their stems instead of just at the tips. We also see primitive lycopods spreading. Boragwanathia, for example, was first found in Australia, which suggests they were more widespread than just the northern hemisphere. So
Yeah.
these were big steps towards the elaborate plants that would come later.
Okay, from basic plumbing to more complex structures. Now, what about the Devonian period, often called the Age of Fishes? But what was happening with plants on land?
Right, so the Devonian, beginning around 419 million years ago, marks a period of serious land colonization by plants. It's not just bacterial and algal mats anymore. You've got these plant communities growing, becoming a major part of soil formation. But these early Devonian plants, they were still quite different from most plants we see today. Many didn't have true roots or leaves like we know them, and some still lacked a lot of vascular tissue. They probably relied a lot on symbiosis with fungi, what we call arbuscular mycorrhizal symbiosis. Basically, the fungi help them take up water and nutrients like phosphorus from the soil in exchange for sugars from the plant.
Like an ancient trade agreement for survival. But how did they spread without seeds or more sophisticated ways to get around?
It was mostly vegetative reproduction. New plants growing from fragments of the parent plant making these clonal colonies. They also used spores for reproduction and dispersal. But because they didn't have strong support structures or efficient transport, they stayed low to the ground, relatively short. But then in the late Devonian, there's this remarkable boom in diversity.
Oh.
Yeah, we call it the Devonian explosion. All sorts of larger, more complex plants appear. Lycophytes, sphenophytes, the ancestors of horsetails ferns, and progymnosperms, which are like the precursors to gymnosperms, the group that includes conifers and cycads.
An explosion of green diversity. What was driving all this rapid evolution?
Well, several key things evolved during this time. Many of those late Devonian plants developed true roots, better for anchoring and getting deeper water and nutrients. They also developed true leaves, boosting their photosynthesis with all that extra surface area. And we see the first trees, like Archaeopteris and the giant Cladoxylopsids. They had actual wood, so they could grow tall. And then there's prototaxites, which is interesting because it wasn't a plant, it was a giant fungus.
Oh.
Yeah, the fruiting body could grow over 8 meters tall, towering over the landscape. But most importantly, towards the end of the Devonian, the very first seed-forming plants appeared.
Seeds. Talk about a game changer. No more relying on water for fertilization.
Oh. Exactly. And this whole plant diversification had big ecological consequences. Primitive arthropods evolved alongside them, and we see the early stages of that codependence between insects and seed plants that we see everywhere today. Plus, all those roots and the increasing plant biomass, they likely had a big impact on erosion and sediment. And importantly, that huge greening of the continents, that was pulling a lot of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Some scientists think that might have even contributed to a big extinction event at the end of the Devonian. And it was also during this time that vertebrates and arthropods really got a foothold on land, taking advantage of these developing plant ecosystems.
So plants were actively shaping the planet and driving the evolution of other life. Let's move to the Carboniferous period, famous for its giant coal swamps. What kind of plants were in charge back then?
The early Carboniferous flora, beginning around 359 million years ago, had a lot in common with the late Devonian. But as the Carboniferous went on, we see several new plant groups becoming really important. We've got the equus-tails. They're the ancestors of modern horse-tails, but much larger, the sphenophyllales, which were scrambling or climbing plants, lycopodiales, which included smaller club mosses and those huge tree-like forms, lepidodendrales, those impressive scale trees we talked about earlier, filicales ferns, many of which look surprisingly similar to species alive today.
Wow.
Then there's the medullosails, early seed plants known as seed ferns, and the cordtails, which were early relatives of cycads and conifers.
You mentioned scale trees earlier. Can you paint us a picture of what they look like? How impressive were they in the Carboniferous?
Oh, they were dominant features. These Carboniferous lycophytes, the lepidodendrals, they were nothing like the little club mosses you see today. We're talking towering trees, up to 30 meters tall, with trunks as wide as 1.5 meters, like lepidodendron itself with that scaly bark, and sigillaria, which had leaf scars arranged in vertical rows. And their fossilized root systems, we call them stigmaria, they're so distinctive.
And they form the foundation of those coal swamps, right?
Exactly. That massive biomass buried in those oxygen-poor swamps under pressure for millions of years, that's what turned into the coal we use today. The ferns are pretty interesting, too. Some of their fronds look almost identical to modern ferns, and many were probably epiphytic, growing on those big lycophytes. There were genera like Pecopteris and the tree ferns Megaphyton and Calopteris. Seed ferns, like Cyclopteris and Neuropteris, also did well, representing a key step in seed plant evolution. The equus-tails had their giant form calamites, which had trunks 30 to 60 centimeters wide and could grow up to 20 meters tall, not your average horsetail. Stenophyllum was a more delicate climber with whorls of leaves. It was probably related to both calamites and today's horsetails. And then there's the chordates, tall plants with strap-like leaves related to cycads and conifers, and they probably loved the swampy areas around the edges of those forests. True coniferous trees, like Walchia, showed up a bit later, preferring drier habitats.
A rich and diverse plant world. What happened as the Paleozoic ended, moving into the Permian period? What was the dominant vegetation like?
So the Permian, starting around 299 million years ago, continued a lot of those Carboniferous trends at first. But then, around the middle of the Permian, things changed. Those swamp-loving lycopod trees, like lepidodendron and sigillaria, they started to decline. More advanced conifers took their place. They were better suited for the drier, more variable climate that was becoming more common. Interestingly, over on the South China continent, which was isolated near the equator, those lycopods and swamp forests kept going strong. The Permian was also a time when many important conifer groups really branched out, including the ancestors of a lot of conifer families we see today. Ginkgos and cycads popped up on the scene too, adding to the seed plant diversity.
Wow.
There were lots of rich forests with a mix of all these plants. And then there were the gigantopterids, a really interesting group with large leaves. Some scientists think some of them might even be in the lineage that led to flowering plants. But, true flowers didn't evolve for millions of years yet. So the Permian was a transition period, with those old giants fading and these more modern-looking seed plants on the rise.
So the Paleozoic ends with the plant world shifting towards something that looks more familiar to us, with conifers and cycads. What about the Mesozoic era, the age of dinosaurs? What was the plant scene like then?
Well, the Triassic period, which kicked off the Mesozoic around 252 million years ago, had some leftovers from the Paleozoic,
Oh boy.
certain types of lycophytes. But the stars of the show were cycads. Ginkgophytes, think of them as ancestors to our modern ginkgo biloba and glossopterids, which were mainly in the southern hemisphere. Seed plants, or spermatophytes, really took over. Conifers were thriving in the northern hemisphere, while dichroidium, a seed fern with those distinctive forked leaves, was the most common tree in the southern hemisphere during the early Triassic.
Cycads and ginkgos, yeah, we can still recognize those today, or at least their relatives. Now, what about the Jurassic, the age of dinos? What kind of plants were feeding and sheltering them?
That dry climate of the Triassic, it eased up in the Jurassic, especially at higher latitudes.
Okay.
So things got lusher, warmer, more humid. Think jungles covering big parts of the landscape, especially in the north. Conifers were still on top, the most diverse group and the majority big trees. A lot of conifer families we see today were doing great back then. Araucariaceae, like monkey puzzle trees, Cephalotaxaceae, which includes plum yews, pinnaceae pines, firs, spruces, Podocarpaceae podocarps, Taxaceae yews, and Taxodidae, which includes redwoods and their relatives. Quite a lineup.
Wow.
Then there's the Caryopydiaceae, a conifer family that's extinct now, but they were dominant in the lower latitudes, adapted to those drier conditions. And the Benedictales, which looked a bit like cycads, but aren't directly related. Cycads, ginkgos, and tree ferns were pretty common too, and smaller ferns probably filled in the gaps underneath. Catoniaceous seed ferns were another important group. They were probably shrubs or small trees, and ginkgo-like plants were everywhere in the mid to high northern latitudes. Down south, it was still podocarps doing well, while ginkgos and a group called Cechinasciales were rarer. So imagine a world full of conifers, with cycads, ginkgos, and ferns.
A real Jurassic Park vibe. Then comes the Cretaceous period, the end of the line for the non-avian dinosaurs. What was the big plant story happening then?
The Cretaceous period, beginning around 145 million years ago, is when flowering plants really took off. They're also known as angiosperms.
Okay.
They actually popped up earlier in the Mesozoic, but it wasn't until later in the Cretaceous, around the Campanian age, that they really became the main plant group in most ecosystems.
Flowering plants, the ancestors of most of the plants we see today. What made them so successful? How did they outcompete those gymnosperms that had been dominant for so long?
A few things helped. One big one was coevolution, especially with pollinators like bees and other insects.
Right.
These relationships, they benefited both the plants and the insects. It made reproduction more efficient and targeted, plus it increased genetic diversity and sped up evolution. During the Cretaceous, we also see the first of many modern tree groups, figs, planes, magnolias. But even with angiosperms spreading rapidly, some of those older gymnosperms like conifers and cycads kept doing well.
Yeah.
Other groups, like the Benetales, went extinct before the period ended. So the Cretaceous was a time of big floral change.
So the Cretaceous set the stage for the plant world as we know it. Then we come to the Cenozoic era, the age of mammals. How did plants change after that extinction event that wiped out the dinosaurs?
The Cenozoic, which started with the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction event about 66 million years ago, had a big impact on plants. But flowering plants bounced back quickly and took over almost all land ecosystems. This era also saw grasslands and savannas expanding because of shifting climates. And that relationship between flowering plants and insects, it kept going strong, in many cases getting even tighter.
Okay.
One major event was the evolution of grasses around 35 million years ago. They were great at growing in open, dry places, and this led to huge grasslands that cover so much of Earth today, supporting all sorts of animals.
Grasses, fundamental to so many ecosystems, and of course to us. So when did humans really start having a major impact on plant evolution?
Bringing things way closer to the present. Around 10,000 years ago, humans in the Fertile Crescent started developing agriculture.
Wow.
That's a turning point in the human-plant relationship. It's when we started domesticating plants. It began with those Neolithic founder crops, the ancestors of so many of our staple foods today.
Right.
This shift to growing our own food, along with domesticating animals, led to a population boom and a much bigger impact on the environment. We see archaeological evidence of early farming settlements like Jericho, which had a surprisingly big population for its time.
Mm.
Interestingly, back then, the Sahara was much greener than today.
Really?
Yeah, there were rivers, lakes, even monsoons, which supported different types of plants. Around 8,000 years ago, common wheat appeared in Southwest Asia. It was a natural hybrid of ember wheat and a wild goat grass. But humans picked the best ones and cultivated them. And around 6,500 years ago, we see two major rice species getting domesticated: Asian rice, Oryza sativa, and African rice, Oryza glaberrima. So agriculture, while relatively recent, is a huge part of plant evolution now.
It's amazing. From those single-celled algae billions of years ago to farming wheat and rice, it's an unbelievable journey.
Truly. And the timescale, the constant change in plant evolution, it's awe-inspiring.
Yeah.
Every period brought new challenges, new adaptations, incredible innovations. That's how we ended up with the diversity and complexity in the plant world today.
It really makes you appreciate the plants around us, and it makes you think about how we're affecting their future.
A good thing to consider.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for taking this deep dive with us into the timeline of plant evolution. It's been an incredible journey.
It was my pleasure. It's a story that's still being written.
And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed exploring the history of plants as much as we did.